From a VHS light gun system to one that has been around since 2004 and is still being made, we count down 10 game systems that you might not have known about. I'm Gurgak, and okay, let's just get started. Number 10. The Zap Export. The Zap Export was released in the United States in 2004, a few years before the Nintendo Wii, which is noted as some games that are meant to be played in the same vein as the Wii. But instead of the Wii's motion controls, the Zap Export used sensors, which was still very buggy to say the least. Only 10 games were released for the system, unless you count Japan exclusives, which brings it up to a whopping 14. The interesting fact about this system is that it's one of the longest running on store shelves. These suckers are still being produced, so that, as of the last update in August of 2016, gives it around a 13-year lifespan. A system that's been around since 2004 and is still available for purchase, only having 14 games in its library? Oh god, how weird is that? It's probably the reason why this is not well known. Not just because the games are mediocre at best, but because there's only 14 games for the system. And those games that are on there are actually just sports titles, so just take that as you will. Number 9. Lasertor Active. Made by Pioneer in 1993, the Lasertor Active was a multimedia device capable of playing laser discs, compact discs, console games, and even some karaoke discs. You could even get an adapter which could let you play Sega Genesis games. How cool is that? Well, what's not cool was the price tag, which back then would cost you close to $1,000. But in a way, I can see the appeal of it. All in one, that would be nice. The games were all what you would expect, most being full motion video, Dragon Lair-esque type of games, or in some way try to have animation instead of actual traversable levels. Only a little over 30 games were released for this beast worldwide, and most of them you could find on other systems like Myst and TimeGal. In some ways it's not a game system, and in others it is. It did have its own library, but I'm gonna guess most people got it for its multimedia purpose and not its library of games. Probably that, and its price point was the reason why this faded into obscurity. Number 8. The Daewoo Zimix. Sold only in South Korea, the Daewoo Zimix was an MSX-based system, which the MSX was a computer back in the early 80s. Any cartridge that worked for the MSX computer was compatible with the Zimix, but there were no exclusives for the system. Honestly, nothing really much else to note on the Daewoo Zimix. Only reason why it's not well known now is because it was only made in South Korea, but there this system had a long run lasting from 1985 to 1995. Number 7. The RDI Halcyon. The RDI Halcyon was a video game console that was planned to be released in 1985. Just like the Laser Active that I said before, it was going to use laser discs. Only 2 games were released to the system, Thayer's Quest and NFL Football LA Raiders vs SD Chargers. By far one of the most expensive game systems of all time, in 1985 especially being $2,500. What makes the Halcyon interesting is that only 12 systems are known to exist, so nobody really knows if that had a retail release or not. The company RDI even said the system was going to be entirely voice activated, which if you think about the Xbox Kinect nowadays and how iffy that is, picture that in the mid 80s. Talk about a horror show. Number 6. The Memorex VIS. Made in 1992, you can consider this a lesser version of the already hated Philips CDI. The system was only sold at Radio Shacks, where even with its small run, only was able to sell a measly 11,000 units. Which even compared to the CDI itself, it sold around 1 million units after its run, with its best playing and selling game being Link's The Challenge of Golf, and most other titles being edutainment. There's a good reason why this system was left behind in the dust. Number 5. The Action Max. Made by Worlds of Wonder in 1987, so far we've had cartridge systems, CD systems, even Laserdisc systems. Now it's about time we got a VHS system. Only having 5 games, each one was a shooter, with each game being pretty much the same. After one playthrough, you're done. No replayability whatsoever. Makes sense as it is a VHS tape, but you'd think the system would at least make another difficulty on how many times you shoot an object or something. It's probably the reason why this never took off. Number 4. The Nintendo IQ Player. The IQ Player was made in China during the early 2000s. This was around the time when games were not shown often in China as the Chinese government did not allow them. Being a plug-and-play N64 console actually released by Nintendo, it is only able to be used with one controller, while that controller itself is the system. The games allowed for the IQ player were very limited. Although first playing, there are 4 demos and a full version of Dr. Mario 64. Some weird choices for games were available for the system like Super Smash Bros. But without the very rare 4-player multi-tap that was available, it almost seems like a waste. All in all, only 14 games were released for the system, with the last one being Animal Crossing. The way you would get them is either online via USB jack or a specific kiosk that you could maybe find where you lived. China was very strict with the video game market, so after the IQ player there was never a sequel, unless you count the Wii, which was only sold in Hong Kong specifically. I could not find much on how well it sold, but for the time I'd expect it to have done decently well. But for there only to be a handful of games and each one of them being sold months apart, it probably faded out of everyone's mind fairly quickly. Number 3. The Socotra Order Bandai Video Challenger. Just like the Action Max, this was another light gun VHS system, but this time the games are very well known. Titles like Afterburner were available for the system, and even a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Godzilla game. Jeez, a better selection than what the Action Max had, I'll tell you that. It used an infrared sensor to find where the objects were. This is not a system, but instead just a gun. You could use your run-of-the-mill VHS player to enjoy these games. But after the release of the Famicom and PC engine, it could not pick up any steam that it once had, and ended production shortly afterwards. Number 2. The Funtech Super A-Can. Made in Taiwan in 1995, the Super A-Can was very powerful for being a 16-bit console. But being released around the time the 3D systems like the N64 and the PS1 was coming out, it stood no chance in the competition. Not to mention, it was pretty expensive. The game library also shows how long the system was on store shelves, with 12 known release games and 9 games that never got past the prototype stage. Titles themselves were decent in that regard, but nothing to write home about, so the Super A-Can was discontinued shortly after its release. If you wanted to collect for the system, I hope you have a hefty wallet, as some games can reach pretty high prices, just for the fact of their limited time on store shelves in Taiwan of all places. Number 1. The Nintendo Teleview. The Nintendo Teleview was an online service for the Super Famicom in 1995. It was a lot like the Sega Channel. It had daily games you could download and play that were specific to the system. From newspaper articles to demos to even full-on different experiences of old classics, it was ahead of its time by about 10 to 15 years. It was popular enough to stay afloat in Japan 4 to 5 years, discontinuing their services around the year 2000, but a lot of people really did enjoy the add-on. There were some games like Super Mario Bros. 2 that had a story to go along with it with full-on musical scores and voice acting. Most of this audio is missing or in horrible condition, and even with the games being emulatable, there is no way to retrieve the music or sound because it was broadcasted through satellite, not via the cartridge itself. Selling over 2 million units, it's by far the most sold console out of these 10, but if you are not in Japan, this was never known about as Nintendo kept any information about it solely in Japan. Which sucks, because I would think this would have sold really well in other areas around the world. Do you by chance have any ideas for the top 10 countdown? Let us know in the comment section down below and we might use it in an upcoming video. That's exciting! Okay, bye.